Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I can see we already have 80 people here. And I'd like to introduce from Institute Professor Mara Kolesas, who will introduce our guest today. Go ahead, Professor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to open up this conversatory on racism part 2, and I'm particularly happy today because we have with us Professor Ira Katznelson. I'm sure you've read his bio. It would take me a long time to list all of Ira's career, books, multidisciplinary expertise, and institutional positions in educational research institutions, but I am taking the liberty today to tell you something beyond that. He's a captivating storyteller, not only a professor, but a teacher, a thinker who takes perplexities, concepts, and people very seriously. A lover of food, design, and beauty, as the dedication of the book that we're going to discuss says. It's dedicated to his daughter. Thanks for designing and beautifying. He was the reader of my dissertation, and it left a long-lasting impact, as you can see, because he's here. So thank you, Ira, for illuminating and radiating light. It's just a pleasure to have you.
It's wonderful, wonderful, wonderful to be here with you, Mara, and with everyone. I'm keenly looking forward to our conversation.
So we're going to discuss today of the many books you've written. When Affirmative Action was white, and When Affirmative Action was white tells the untold story about the New Deal and the fair deal. It puts forward a very strong argument that you would tell us about a very original account on affirmative action. And as you put it before my question, and I'm quoting from your book, you said, writing as a historian, I want to set the record straight. As a political scientist, I would like to understand the mechanisms that produce these outcomes. And as a citizen, I wish to present these understandings in order to alter our misconceptions and reposition the direction of how we think, talk, and act about affirmative action. And you start your book with the address, the commencement address that President Johnson delivered in 1965 at Howard University, like the most prominent historically Black university. And in this address, Johnson explained why opportunity was not enough, right, to ensure the civil right of disadvantaged Americans and, Black Americans. And this address provided the motivation for you to write the book. Why is the question.
So my motivation, as you stated, did have three parts. Understand what happened, set the record straight, understand what shaped what happened, and then take what we understand from the historical past and deploy it. I wanted to write this book as an intervention in the ongoing conversation, which continues to be an ongoing conversation about affirmative action, because I was unhappy about key features of that conversation. But the speech by Lyndon Johnson, this quite remarkable address delivered at the end of June 1965, before the Voting Rights Act had passed, but after the Civil Rights Act had passed, in the midst of this period of tumult in American life that produced racial change. Johnson posed a question he said he did not know how to answer, and I was motivated by that question. The question was the following. Between the end of the Second World War, 1945, and the 2 decades later when this speech was given, the prosperity of America had advanced enormously. This was a period of economic growth, largesse, low unemployment, and so on. His question, why in this period had the gap between white and Black Americans grown wider? Now, African Americans, he observed, were better off in 1965 than in 1945. But white Americans were better off in a more significant way, thus opening a wider gap. That was Johnson's question. I might add that two things about, well, one about that speech and one about a prior speech of Johnson's. Remember, Johnson spoke with a Southern accent, sort of Southern accent, from Texas, from Austin. But he was manifestly a Southerner. And he asked this question at a historically Black college and said, I'm not sure I can answer it, but what I do know, and he used the famous image of a starting point at a race, that put two people to start a race, but one whose feet have been in shackles, that's not going to be a fair competition. And he said that unless we have remediable remedies for the past, the notion of equality of opportunity will be an illusion, like two runners starting a race, but one whose feet have been shackled. So we need what he began to call affirmative action. This was a remarkable idea. My question was, what do we know about the manner in which the feet have been shackled? I'll come back to that. But we should recall that when Lyndon Johnson was elected to the Senate, not long before, in 1948, this is now 1965, but he gave his maiden speech in 1949. So 16 years earlier. 16 years ago doesn't seem so long ago. And that speech, that other speech, had the following literary quality. Every third paragraph began with the phrase, "We of the South." We of the South, we of the South. We of the South, said Johnson in 1949, we're not racists, but we don't, at least I'm not a racist, he said, but we don't believe the federal government has any role in remedying racial inequality. And he went from there to give birth to affirmative action as a policy matter just 16 years later. And why did he do that? Well, he was now president of the United States, not a senator from Texas. But one reason he did that was because he had come to think that the imagery of equal opportunity was not enough. It wouldn't work unless we understood the roots of inequality in a deeper way. And in part, I wrote this book in the spirit of Johnson's speech of 1965, recognizing just how far he had come since 1949, but trying to find answers to the question he, in that speech, said he did not know how to answer.
So that's remarkable because if I may say, as a foreigner, knowing general knowledge until someone reads your book, and now your book has opened up, this understanding for everybody, the idea of affirmative action starts, at least explicitly, with Johnson, and then the policies, right, with Nixon. But you have an original account of affirmative action because you go back to look at the 30s and 40s in the book, yes, at the New Deal and the Fair Deal, and you say, this is where affirmative action started. So can you tell us a bit about that and actually what you understand by affirmative action? Because the accounts of affirmative actions are very diverse. You do not provide a normative account of affirmative action, but rather a descriptive one based on a very detailed historical examination together with political mechanisms, right?
Right. So the giveaway is the title of the book. When affirmative action was white. Affirmative action after 1965, one could say, when affirmative action was principally, though not exclusively, Black. also Latino, etc. But I write about when affirmative action was white. What do I mean by that? By the way, I should say as a footnote, academics love footnotes, so I'll give you one. I owe the title of the book to the wonderful journalist, op-ed writer, E.J. Dionne, who's now at the Washington Post. E.J. is a very old friend. He has a PhD in political theory from Oxford. We met at an American Political Science Association meeting decades ago, and we became friends. And I met him at one of these political science gatherings, and he said to me, this is 20 years ago, "What are you working on, Ira?" And I told him about this book. He said, "What are you going to call it?" I said, "I think I'm going to call it Affirmative Action in White and Black." He looked at me and he said, "That's terrible. Actually, the words he used are not to be repeated on this Zoom call." But they weren't friendly. And I said, "Okay, Mr. Distinguished Journalist, can you do better?" And he put his head down for 10 seconds, looked up and said, "When affirmative action was white." And that's the birth of this title. But it precisely captures what the book is about. It goes like this. If you allow me a bit of background. The Democratic Party during the 1930s and 1940s was a party of very strange bedfellows. In California, in Oregon and Washington on the West Coast, in the North, in the Midwest, Illinois, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, in the East, New York, New Jersey, and into New England. The Democratic Party was a party that looked a lot like social democratic parties of the left in Europe. A party in favor of strong government action to remedy inequality, to provide security, a party that supported unions, a party often of immigrants. That was half the Democratic Party. The other part of the Democratic Party was the party elected from 17 states in the Union that in the 1930s and 1940s practiced mandatory, legalized racial segregation. Not just in Mississippi, but in Delaware. It was illegal for any township to put Black and white children in the same school. Quite remarkable. We had from Delaware down through Florida into Texas, we had 17 states in the Union that mandated racial inequality. In the year 1940, those 17 states elected 34 United States senators. Every single one was a Democrat. The Democratic Party consisted of a marriage, I like to say a marriage of Sweden and South Africa, a marriage of Swedish social democracy and apartheid South Africa. How did that?
By the
Sorry,
way,
go ahead.
No, that the regular understanding of the South is actually 11 states, but in your book you make a strong argument to expand this block because of these characteristics that you are bringing up.
So let me say a word about that, and then answer your prior question, which is the core of the book. The account of the South as 11 states dates from the fact that it was the number 11 was the number of states who seceded from the Union and created the Confederacy in 1860. And that's the Confederate South. But we should remember that in 1860, there were not just 11, but 14 originally, then 15 slave states. And those states included Kentucky and Missouri and so on, and Maryland, and Delaware, and then there was Virginia and West Virginia. West Virginia broke away from Virginia during the Civil War. But if you look at the 17 Jim Crow segregationist states, they are the 15 original slave states in the country, plus West Virginia, plus Oklahoma, which was not a state in 1860. Oklahoma only became a state in 1907, I believe. But those 17 are absolutely continuous, were continuous with the slave states of the early American Republic, only 11 of which left the Union. And indeed, when the Emancipation Proclamation was declared, the states were freed, not in all the slave states, but only in the Confederate states. It was only with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution that slavery was forbidden everywhere. So 34 United States senators. That made the South a veto group in the Democratic Party because of if a president wishes to veto a piece of legislation, it could only then pass with 2/3 of the Senate and the House overturning it. So the South was a veto group. Even more, the South controlled disproportionately the committees of the United States Congress, because the South was a one-party system in the main, which meant that Southern members of Congress gained seniority. And with seniority, they gained control of the committees of Congress. Now, my story is essentially the following. I asked, what difference did it make that Southerners had this power and control in the Democratic Party? Answer, in key areas of public policy, Social Security, which passed in 1935, the Wagner Act, which gave unions protection to organize, 1935, 1937-38, the passage in 38 of the Fair Labor Standards Act, which gave us minimum wages and maximum work hours, a 40-hour a week. The character of the American military during the Second World War, and the GI Bill that passed for veterans after the war. All of these elements, all of them, social policy, labor policy, military policy, veterans policies, all of them passed through a Congress in which Southern members had disproportionate power. So what happened? Two mechanisms were used in this period by the Southerners to try to protect racial segregation and the Jim Crow system of the South. They did two things: in Social Security, in labor law, in minimum wages and maximum hours. They imposed the regulation that farm workers and maids, domestic workers, would be outside the game. Yes, Social Security, but no Social Security for domestic workers. Yes, Social Security, but no Social Security for farm workers. Yes, protection for unions, but not unions of farm workers. Yes, a minimum wage, but not for maids or farm workers, and so on. The second thing the Southerners did with respect to military policy, first, they insisted that the military remain racially segregated during the war, as it did. American military was racially segregated until 1948. And they insisted that the administration of the GI Bill, and the GI Bill, many of us here, either personally or more likely our parents or grandparents, benefited enormously from the GI Bill, which produced mortgages, small business loans, job training, college educations for veterans. But what the Southerners succeeded in doing in their committees that wrote the bill was to make sure all the administration would be local, would be at the state and local level. So if you were Black and came home to Mississippi and qualified for college, unless the state legislature gave the money to the historically Black colleges in Mississippi, like Tougaloo College, you wouldn't get a place. But they did vote enough money in those legislatures for the University of Mississippi. So you had 80,000 qualified Black veterans in the South who never got their college education. And I call this unevenness of benefits, whether for Social Security or for the GI Bill, the period when affirmative action was white, because the government was using its policy power to create benefits and advantages for white veterans that were not available on equal terms to Black veterans. Not all Black veterans. That Black veterans in the North could get GI Bill benefits, albeit with some discrimination. But in the South, if you wanted a mortgage, you had to go to your local bank. And if you were African American, you were almost certain not to get one. And we know that if you were a sharecropper or a maid in the South, you were not going to get Social Security, not until the 1950s. So that's when affirmative action was white. And that helped open up huge gaps between white and Black Americans in terms of income and wealth, which persist, alas, to this day.
So we're going to go to just the changes to today, but you make a very strong argument about like the massive point of state building and federal intervention, how that actually explicitly privileged whites, both politically and economically, excluding Blacks from the benefits of full citizenship, and also how the levels of the federal, the state, and the local played legally, right?
Yes.
To even if illegitimately, we could say, or even immorally, right? But legally to produce these outcomes. And I'm interested just to point in the priorities that these groups have, because you're saying the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats, but you also have the Republicans. So
Yes.
you state that it was kind of a de facto three-party system as opposed to, a two-party system, and the alliances in votings, partisan, non-partisan, defection switch, right? From the 30s
Correct.
to the 40s. And it has to do with labor, right? And also with keeping white supremacy. Would you speak to that shift?
Yes, let me just say one thing before directly answering that question. None of the pieces of legislation that I've mentioned have the word race in it, or the word Black in it, or the word white in it, or African American in it, or any other group. The law was written, those laws, whether the Social Security Act or the Wagner Act, or I'll talk in a moment about the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, a key labor act. They were, on the face of it, race neutral. They never said these are laws for affirmative action for whites, but that's how they functioned. Now, let me come to the labor question, or moreover, before the labor question, the three-party system arrangement. In effect, the United States had what Mara just called a three-party system. Of course, there were two big parties, Democrats and Republicans, but the Democrats operated as if they were on two different planets. In the South, with the disenfranchisement of Blacks and with rules that kept Blacks out of the franchise, literacy tests, the poll tax, and many others. Many of these rules actually kept poor whites out of the franchise as well. So you had a system where Blacks were not voting and where the actual turnout rates for elections were very low. In the whole state of Mississippi in 1940, a state with more than 2 million people, electing 7 members of the House of Representatives, only 43,000 people voted. very different. In the state of California in the 1940s, when Richard Nixon, say, was elected to the House of Representatives before he was elected to the Senate, he had to receive something like 130,000 votes just in one seat and just the winning candidate. So we're talking about a political system that was low franchise and essentially one real party. Because why didn't people vote, those who were eligible? There was no point in voting. Everyone knew the Democrat would win the election. But that did mean that the real contests in the South were in primaries. So the only point of hazard for a Southern Democrat was in the Democratic Party itself, not in the two-party system. So it was a one-party system, and most Southern Democrats got elected over and over and over again, often without opposition. I think, I might be wrong, but I think in 1940 in Mississippi, only 2 of the 7 candidates for the House had any opposition at all, primary or general election. And they accumulated seniority in the House and the Senate. The Democrats in the North and the West were running in a two-party system. They had to renew themselves in office with an open franchise. And then, of course, they were competing with Republicans, who were often very successful. In the early 1930s, there were Democratic landslides. But by 1938, 1940, and 1942, the Republican Party made a comeback in the North. And by 1946, the House and the Senate had majorities that were Republican. And the Democratic Party was majority Southern. Now we come to the labor issue and the shifts. In the 1930s, against Republican opposition, Northern and Southern Democrats passed the Wagner Act in 1935, which facilitated labor organizing. The Republicans didn't like this. They were a pro-business party. The Southerners voted in favor, not because they loved unions in the main, but because they understood that the unity of the Democratic Party required supporting unions on one condition, that farm workers and maids would not be protected by that legislation. As I've said, the same with minimum wages, maximum hours. But then what happened? The CIO got organized, the auto workers, the steel workers, and arguably, they were the most racially integrated institutions in American life. The Southerners were afraid of these unions. And by the mid and late 1940s, they joined the Republicans in a coalition to change labor law. And the most important example is the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947. The Taft-Hartley Act restricted the rights of unions and created what are known as right-to-work laws. Laws that say you can't have a closed shop. You can't have unions win an election and then every worker in that industry has to belong to the union. And we know when you have right-to-work laws, when people can get the benefits of a union contract without paying union dues, without being a member of the union, sooner or later the union falls apart. Taft-Hartley passes in 1947 with a coalition of Republicans and Southern Democrats against Northern Democrats. And Harry Truman, as president, vetoed the bill. He called it an act of labor, slave labor. But the bill passed over his veto because a unanimous group of Southern Democrats joined Republicans to overturn older labor law and create a new labor regime. And the consequence of that was the unions failed to organize in the South, as well as much of the Southwest. The consequence of that was African Americans in the South could not enjoy the same advantages that workers in the North and in the West were enjoying as a result of being members of labor unions. In states like Wisconsin and Michigan in the late 1940s, 75 and 80% of private wage workers belonged to unions. In Alabama, Mississippi, a trivial number, and even less in other states in the South. Alabama had steel mills, but most of the South wasn't sufficiently industrial to successfully have a union organizing before Taft-Hartley and especially after. And the CIO tried and the AFL tried in the South, but they were defeated under the terms of the new legislation. So that's an example of where the Republicans and the Southern Democrats began to discover each other as partners. And the Northern and Western Democratic Party became less and less capable of bringing about equality in American life.
Or can you say that is that one of the reasons why this country doesn't have a national labor unionizing, and it's like directly related to segregationism, right?
Yes, I think there are two pieces to the story. The first is the period, say 1945 to 55, and then what's happened since. If you, at the very end of the Second World War, both the AFL and the CIO unions thought the future lies in the South. They sent organizers into the South. They said, look, you've got thousands, hundreds of thousands, actually millions of workers without union representation. And we believe they want it, white as well as black, black as well as white. But very quickly, when labor law was changed, it became almost impossible to organize those workers in the South. And the same was true of workers in New Mexico and Arizona, in often Latino, Mexican background, who would have joined unions, but the new legal framework made that very difficult. And in consequence, what the union movement did was to retract its attention, to close off its attention and concentrate overwhelmingly on states and industries where they already had lots of power and lots of standing. In the docks in California and New York, in the steel mills of Pennsylvania, in the auto plants of Detroit. And the union movement continued to grow between 1947 and 1955, so that in 1955, a good 1/3 of Americans, workers, belonged to unions. But in states like Wisconsin, 85% belong to unions. So, but on average, 35%. But then what happened? The industries that were most heavily unionized, think of steel and automobiles, were open up to global competition as the rest of the world recovered from the Second World War, as Japan began to build cars and steel mills, as Europe, the German steel and automobile industries recovered, the French steel and automobile industries recovered, the British steel and automobile industries recovered. And over time, not immediately, but in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the number of people employed in those industries in the United States dramatically declined as the globe became more prosperous. And the unions had nowhere else to go. They couldn't organize in the South. They couldn't organize industries very well where they didn't have representation. And we entered a period of decline of American unions. Today, 6% of American wage workers belong to unions. 1955, 35% belonged to unions. That's a radical change. And that has changed American politics as well as American economics, because when unions are strong, they explain to their workers, they have a story about why we have a lack of prosperity or inequality. In the absence of unions, there are alternative stories. Immigrants steal your jobs, or trade policy steals your jobs, not the union story about why the jobs are not paying well enough and not well enough protected. So American politics changed, as well as questions of the status of different groups in American life. And as unions have declined, that produced more competition in Black workers. And you saw this in the 1960s and 70s in campaigns of folks like Governor Wallace of Alabama, when he went north and ran for office and won white working class votes on the grounds that it's Black people that are taking away your jobs. And certainly a campaign against affirmative action as challenging. Whereas the union movement has strongly, not the construction workers, but the workers in auto plants and steel plants often have supported affirmative action as a way to create solidarity across racial lines amongst working people.
Well, so from what you're saying, I mean, rereading your book, at some point you say that, you know, all these policies kind of like tie the Gordian knot between race and class on the one hand for Black people, but this also kind of ties like the formal working class to white people, precisely because of the exclusion of Blacks from the union, or trying to exclude Black from unionizing, definitely in the South, not so much in the North. How are these two trends relate to, you know, these alternative stories that you were mentioning today, particularly what has been conceptualized as the wages of whiteness, right? Like the price that the white, even working class being exploited, kind of pay to belong, you know, to that group, excluding other from the polity, which, because your story is a story from basically.
So first, I would underscore that the story I tell in this book, of course, it's not the whole story of race and racism in America, but the story I tell is very much a story not about private discrimination or personal racial attitudes. It's a story about how the authoritative powers of the federal government were used, spending billions and billions of dollars to give some groups advantages over other groups in American life. And we can call that the wages of whiteness, but the whiteness literature, which is very powerful, sometimes is about personal decision and advantage. And my focus is primarily on not only on not personal, but institutional advantages, but not just on any institutions, but on the institutions of government and government policy. The making of law and policy under the authority of Congress and the president, having the profound effect of shaping, let me turn the light on, by the way, which is, the only light is a reflection from a computer. So let me see if this, is that better?
Yes.
And now you see,
the frame
and
of
now you can see
height.
Franklin Roosevelt's portrait over my shoulder. As I was telling Mara and others earlier, this painting of this image of Roosevelt, it's a copy, not the original, but was painted the very day Franklin Roosevelt died. And Roosevelt remains a hero of mine, notwithstanding the incredible compromises he really was forced to make in order to pass the New Deal. And Truman had to make similar compromises often for the fair deal. We can come back to that, what might be called rotten compromises, and how we assess them morally and ethically. But the the question we were dealing with, that I'm dealing with, is not whiteness as personal, but whiteness as imposed through the political system at the time on the pieces of legislation that have most shaped modern America. If we didn't have the Social Security Act, we'd have a very different country. If we hadn't had the GI Bill, which created a modern middle class and often gave middle class status to African American soldiers in parts of the country that were not the Deep South. If not for these pieces of legislation, if not for minimum wages, if not for maximum work hours, we would have a radically different United States of America. And embedded inside these progressive laws were rules that systematically and willfully, deliberately disadvantaged a significant part of the population, disproportionately persons of color and disproportionately African American.
Because your story is a story of moral ambiguities as well, and the kind of compromises that you have to make. I mean, you only have the kind of more normative chapter at the very end, but throughout the book, you're reading this in terms of, what are the priorities? What's the larger policy goal? Is it fostering labor and social security for quote unquote almost everyone, right? Or is it segregationism? How do we kind of ponder these two? And there are very bad choices you can say that someone had to do, or there are these political compromises that you always have to do. You call them the dirty compromises, like Avishai Margalit, where he sets like a moral limit. Those, rotten compromise. Right, I'm sorry. The rotten compromises are those who are cruel, right, and humiliate, right, people. But you have to know that in advance. And how do you ponder that as well? And how you define that in terms of the society you live in as well.
So one of the great privileges I have these days is to co-teach a seminar at my university, at Columbia University, with Jack Lew. Jack Lew was Secretary of Treasury in the Obama administration. He was Chief of Staff to President Obama. He was the head of the Office of Management and Budget in the Clinton administration. And he worked at one point, I believe he worked in the Senate at one point for Senator Biden. So this is someone who knows public affairs and knows public policy. And we were talking about this book and a subsequent book I wrote called Fear Itself, The New Deal and the Origins of Our Time, about this issue of being in government and making compromises. And he told me that he thought that the hardest question, which he doesn't know the answer to, was what should the leadership of the Democratic Party have done in 1935 when they wanted to pass Social Security? We know, for example, that the bill that emerged out of the White House included farm workers and maids. They had done a study of technical feasibility, and they concluded it would be possible to include all wage workers in old age pensions in Social Security. The bill went to Congress, and it was rewritten really, in a committee headed by a Southern Democrat, in which the majority of Democrats were from the racist Jim Crow South. They rewrote the bill. Should the president have vetoed the bill? If he'd vetoed the bill, no one would have had Social Security. In 1952, when Dwight Eisenhower was elected president, a Republican Congress was elected as well. Those of you who know me will know I don't often sing the praises of the Republican Party as a citizen. But it was that Congress and that president that ended the restriction on farm workers and maids in Social Security, so that by the end of 1953, every African-American worker was eligible, every worker, um, farm worker, domestic worker, or anything else was eligible for Social Security. So the good of having old age insured by the federal government was extended from the 1950s on for the last 70 years, has included all Americans. Only in the first 20 years, it did not include all Americans. And there were white people, it should be said, who were also excluded from Social Security by virtue of their occupation. But the exclusion was aimed at Blacks explicitly. Now, that's a pretty rotten compromise, but is it a compromise the president should have made? In the long arc, you could say yes. However, there are other features of the New Deal era legislation that never have been solved for, as it were. The one example I will give is mortgages and the GI Bill, or small business loans. Mississippi in 1947 had just over 4,000 small business loans for veterans. Half of the soldiers who came home to Mississippi were Black, but only 2 of those loans went to African Americans. If we look at the formation of wealth in America, which comes out of small business ownership and housing, my father-in-law bought a house after the Second World War in Brooklyn, New York, for, I don't know, $12,000. Today, it must be worth $800,000 conservatively, maybe more. It's a part of, not the most fashionable part of Brooklyn. It's not Park Slope, where it would be worth $2 million.
Nothing is not fashionable in Brooklyn anymore.
That's true. But so anyone in his family who would inherit that house later or have the ability, that is, the family entered the real estate ladder at a certain moment. But if you have to enter 30 and 40 or 50 years later without having had the advantage of access to the GI Bill mortgages, then you start out with a home that cost $500,000, not $15,000. And moreover, we know that the wealth gap between Black and white Americans today, which is principally a real estate gap, is immense. White America has 10 times the wealth on average of Black America. There are exceptions, of course, but and that kind of wealth differential owes much to the uneven administration of the GI Bill when the majority of Black Americans lived in the 17 segregated states.
Because, housing that you bring up, we're going to discuss this with John Powell next time. But home ownership is not only home ownership and the creation of wealth, but with the redlining, the access to education and good education. We all know that at some level, but we don't really kind of put this in the real perspective of what that means for actually possibilities. Maybe not us, but in the general picture, we actually don't. I wanted to move to the changes we have discussed, from, after the 40s and since the 50s till today, when you develop also in FIER itself, when you, I take it as a build up on this previous, argument. Yes. In when affirmative action was white, and basically the building and the creation of the modern American state that we're also going to discuss, in the series with Dia Said. But you point to 2 phases of the state, right? The Janus state, you call it, one domestic, that is, very thick procedurally, and we've seen this very recently, and very thin in terms of public interest, and externally very thick in public interest and very thin procedurally. And I'm wondering whether there's not like a Janus state with a double face also inside, right? Creating, a policy, of inclusion or a minimum threshold to thrive in society and to belong, with, a huge part of a population not being part of that threshold of citizenship. And the question is what happened, then until now, the changes and how we are today.
Let me come, before tackling that really jumbo question, which is about then and now, which I would love to come to. Let me just add one thing to which bridges from the prior to this question. So it may be a small example of how the rules about how public laws are administered, could be election law is another example, can strongly affect outcomes. In the Second World War, as I said, we had a segregated Army and Navy. I actually once held in my hand a document in the National Archive in which the then Department of War wrote a memo to Franklin Roosevelt. The Department of War, by the way, and the military was, the officer class, senior officer class was overwhelmingly Southern. And the majority of senior leadership in the Department of War came from the 17 segregated states. And they wrote a message to the president in 1940 and said, if we were to go to war, we could not afford to have a racially integrated military because that would be a social experiment. And we can't run a social experiment during the war. It actually turned out that having a segregated military was incredibly inefficient in military terms. And by the end of the war, General Eisenhower was putting black and white troops together in the field because when the Nazis were shooting at American soldiers, they didn't much care whether they were white or black. And to keep them apart often meant weakening the units. But during the war, in the segregated military, many blacks developed some skills, carpentry skills in the Navy, for example. But when they returned home under the GI Bill, all soldiers were entitled to job placement through their state labor exchanges. But when the black carpenter went to be placed in a job in Alabama, that person couldn't get a job higher than the level of janitor because there was a kind of racial hierarchy of jobs. The consequence of that was you had a whole generation of people who were denied the ability to use their skills and gain secure, well-employed jobs. And if there was a carpenter who wanted a small business loan to start a little business as a carpenter, they didn't get it from the local bank if they were black. So those differences parlayed over the years into the kind of large differences between whites and blacks in terms of income and wealth that we continue to experience in the United States. Now, you ask a great question, and I love this question about what kind of national state was created out of this system and what were its implications for different parts of the population. And I make the argument in the Fear Itself book that largely through the lenses of the Southern Democrats or through the prisms they created, we got two very different kinds of national states. One in global affairs, the military, the CIA, the control of atomic energy, the Cold War, where we got a very strong state where the presidents articulate a national interest. It is in the interest of the United States to do A and B, and there are almost no limits on what a president can do with that strong sense of public interest. But on the domestic side, the Southerners were very keen to create many, many veto points, procedural veto points, as they did with labor. so that we got a very complicated domestic state. And if you get a government elected, as we've just elected a president, I am willing to call him the president-elect. Vice President Biden will be our president. He has an agenda. It's not a particularly radical agenda. It's creating a public option for health insurance. It's creating new arrangements for the environment to modify the trend toward climate change, and so on. But there are many barriers to passing and getting that kind of legislation. And many of them grow out of the older Southern wish to protect the racial order. And they now tend to protect a more conservative view. We need 60 votes in the Senate to pass legislation, not 50, for example. I could go on about that. So yes, we have a state thick with procedures and thin on a sense of collective interest for domestic matters, and a public state for global affairs that is thin on procedure and strong on public interest. We have this dual American national government, American national state. And that has implications for how to remedy, or whether we can effectively remedy, deep inequalities in American society.
And yeah, that's the core of the question. I wanted to ask you about the changes from that time, after the 50s to today, some of which you kind of hinted, to, but also you talk in the last chapter of the book about affirmative action, not historical in that particular chapter, even though you take Bakke, the Bakke Supreme Court ruling and the position of Powell. So in that prescriptive chapter, and with the changes that we have experienced after the 50, today, how would you address these issues of inequality? If you can talk about like the strict scrutiny and the public interest, and
Yes.
how to acknowledge that it's not a colorblind society, but moving towards a colorblind society?
Let me say that when I wrote the book, I wrote it in part because I was dissatisfied for different reasons with the character of the debate about affirmative action. And that character continues. On the one side, opponents of affirmative action, and you just had a referendum in California about affirmative action. Opponents of affirmative action say affirmative action is not fair. It gives advantages to people because of the color of their skin or their birth background, and in consequence, it doesn't give us the world that Martin Luther King said we should have, in which we don't judge people by the color of their skin, but by the quality of their character, or by what they do with their opportunities. The other side of the debate, and well, let me just say, in principle, that's perfectly fine, except we're back on the Lyndon Johnson question. Is it really equality of opportunity when one group was shackled and another group had advantages? And then you can't start a race and say it's an equal race. But that's would be the line of criticism of the transracial position about affirmative action. The other side of the argument is saying, look, we've had slavery in this country. We've had segregation in this country. We need remedies. We need reparations. We need remediation. And I favor that normatively. I think politically, however, it's not happening and is exceedingly unlikely to happen. I'll give one exception to that in a minute that I've been working on with some members of Congress. But broadly speaking, the plea for reparations on the basis of the history of slavery and the history of segregation does not seem able to win a 50% +1 majority anywhere, even in progressive states like California. So what's the alternative? It seems to me what I argued for is we should take seriously the fact that the depth of racial inequality in America is significantly due to public policy, not to private discrimination, certainly not to slavery, and not to segregation as a whole, but to particular harms that were done by the federal government in the last era of Jim Crow. And I argued, based on the jurisprudence of the Bakke decision, that remedying on that basis meets the strict scrutiny test of Justice Powell. Namely, he said there are two ways in which affirmative action can work. It has to be a remedy to a particular harm, not to the generalized racism, but to a particular harm. So if the University of California, Davis had excluded Black people from medical school on the grounds that they were Black, you could have a quota saying, from now on, 16% of all new medical students would be Black. But they hadn't excluded on that basis. But if they had, well, I say, in Social Security, in minimum wages, in labor law, in the GI Bill, there was such harm. We can quantify it. It was particular. We should remedy it. And the other Powell principle was the remedy must serve the public interest, not just the interest of the people who have been harmed. And I would make the argument that a more just racial order in America would certainly be in the public interest, not just in a private interest. So that's the argument about public and private interest. Now, I would say that there is one opening, one area where you could have very racially targeted affirmative action that would work. And I believe that has to do with the consequences of the GI Bill. Every American believes that someone who serves, I say every American, overwhelmingly Americans believe that any veteran who is willing to risk her or his life, typically his life, for the United States deserves veterans' benefits equally. But they didn't get them equally. When I would tell the story of this book, and sometimes in evangelical white churches in the Deep South, people would say, I can't quite do the Southern accent, that's not fair. Well, the sense that it wasn't fair means we might be able to remedy that. And Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, who is probably the most responsible of any person for the Biden presidency, and Congressman Moulton of Massachusetts, a veteran and a moderate centrist Massachusetts Democrat, are proposing a bill to the House and the Senate, and ultimately the Senate, because they'll get senators to sign on, to do a form of a very targeted affirmative action to remedy the harm done by racial exclusion as a result of the way in which the GI Bill was administered. And I've been advising their congressional staffs on that legislation. And I actually believe it could have a chance of passing. Some conservative Republicans like Senator Scott, African-American of South Carolina, would support such a bill. It isn't just a bill that pits left against right. It's a bill that pits harm done through military policy against veterans. And if you pose it that way, there's a chance of targeted remedy that would meet the Powell principles of affirmative action.
Well, I didn't know about that initiative. But just to recap, you know, the affirmative action is something that has been discussed here and there during the past series. But what you were saying, to bring it out, is like a past harm to the present that has to be institutional and has to be governmental as well. And that can be clearly identified in both kind of origin and impact, right?
Correct.
And address it accordingly via public policy, and not this oversweeping kind of we support affirmative action in general. Right.
Yeah, now I'm not, let me be clear. I think there are other forms of affirmative action which are highly desirable. for example, one of the first forms of affirmative action in the Nixon administration, under the guidance of Secretary of Labor George Shultz, who later became Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. George Shultz paid particular attention to construction unions, where jobs were simply passed along from father to son to child, and in a way that was deeply racially exclusionary. And if you looked at who worked in construction in the early 1970s in America, you couldn't find any African Americans to speak of in union jobs. And he opened up that form of affirmative action, insisted that a certain proportion of jobs for a period go to the formerly excluded group of potential construction workers. There's academic affirmative action. When I was an undergraduate at Columbia, where I now work, in my graduating class, there were 3 Black students out of 650. Today, about 15% of the class is African American, and the majority of the class is 50-50 people of color, broadly defined. This was certainly not so, and this is a self-conscious aim at diversity in higher education, which, broadly speaking, under the Supreme Court guidance of Grutter v. Bollinger and in other Supreme Court decisions, is not just legal, but even desirable. I know about, you can tell me more than I know about debates in California and Texas, for example, about state institutions and affirmative action. But there's no question, I now speak as a teacher and somebody who been in the academy for a long time, our universities that have practiced this form of affirmative action are stronger thereby, both in the composition, but also the subject areas that are discussed, in the nature of human interactions. And I can tell you, when I'm in the classroom at Columbia, I cannot tell you which person was admitted by virtue of diversity standards associated with affirmative action and who wasn't. The character of the university has been transformed by attention to racial diversity and multi-ethnic diversity and gender diversity. And all that has created a stronger system of higher education. But that's not what my book was about. The book was about public affairs, public policy, institutional decisions that badly affected American life across the board and had a long-term impact that we still experience in the life of our country. And we could see it at work in many, many places today.
Yeah, that the point that you open up with education, I mean, it's a whole new different discussion, because you have affirmative action and you have diversity, and you have places like California with Proposition 209, you know, that bans any kind of accommodation, not only in terms of ethnic or national origin, but, you know, color and like gender, and I'm missing one that I can't remember right now. But what you also bring about in the book, that I think it's a very strong argument, because we tend to conflate the discussion about affirmative action to this diversity in education.
Correct.
And it's so much more than that. And you bring it basically to the origins, like about access to home, to the rights of benefits, to, you know, unemployment insurance, and, you know, to public policy, to have access not only to education, you know, via the GI Bill, but to, you know, a minimum standard of citizenship. I don't want to be unfair with the people who want to ask you questions. So I have one question here, and I would continue along this line if there are no other questions. But I have a question from Martin Rasumov, and he's saying, and I know it's Martin because he's Argentine, I know him, so that's why I'm reading it this way. So after more than 50 years of affirmative action, would you consider it has succeeded? And if so, why?
I would follow what Mara was saying a few minutes ago about separating out different kinds and forms of affirmative action. There's no question but that in the professional sectors of American life, law firms, for example, universities, we could give various examples, various business firms, parts of the sports and entertainment industry, where there are rules to try to create a more even playing field across racial lines, and which began to function when you couldn't find any racial minorities in those places. Affirmative action has made a huge difference, and the kind of reproduction of equality doesn't require precisely the same rules of the game that it required 50 years ago. So it's a supple instrument, and it should be thought of that way, not as one size fits all. But we have other areas, I think huge areas of American life, where what I'm calling in this book, when affirmative action was white, continue and has never been remedied by affirmative action. We have not had affirmative action in areas of housing policy. We have not had affirmative action in areas of remedy for losing military benefits under the GI Bill. We have not fully even made up for the 20 plus years in which the majority of Black people in America, their families had no access to Social Security, because that affected subsequent generations who then were supporting their parents and grandparents in ways that for others, Social Security benefits were giving support. So we're a very long way from having practiced affirmative action in many, many zones. We've practiced in some and not others. I said at the very end of the book that my hope was, I'm not sure it was realistic, that in the areas in which the book was addressing, if we only could get one full generation of 25 years of affirmative action remedies, we might then not need them subsequently. That's an empirical question as well as a normative one. I don't believe affirmative action done right has to last forever and ever and ever. We actually want a world in which equality genuinely exists, including equality of opportunity. I'll say one more thing, which, if I may, that maybe not exactly about affirmative action, but about race. What's our goal? The political theorist Michael Walzer wrote wrote many books, but he wrote one which has the title, "What Does It Mean to Be an American?" And he says the great thing for many of us who are Irish American, Polish American, Jewish American, Indian American, you can go through many, Mexican American, when the system, African American, when the system works, the great thing about being an American is the degree of choice on both sides of the hyphen. So I could take you to streets in Greenpoint in Brooklyn, which, despite gentrification, have shops that are overwhelmingly Polish in the language of the signs and the language spoken in the bakery or in the hairdresser. And that there are Polish Americans who are choosing, after generations, to make Polishness a very deep part of their identity. And I can find you other Polish Americans, you will never know they had a Polish background. Their grandparents came from Warsaw or Krakow. They changed their name. It's indistinguishable that they're Polish. And on the American side, it's equally how the degree of assimilation chosen by immigrants into the mainstream of American life is a matter of volition. You have choice on both sides of the hyphen. For African Americans and for many Latino Americans, that choice has not existed. They are branded as Black or Mexican, whether or not they choose to make that a central part of their identity. And their very color makes it hard or impossible for them to access many parts of the American side of the hyphen. The ideal world is that we all have equal choices of the particular and the universal, and how we emphasize each and find a balance of each. And when we're in that world where people genuinely have that choice and genuinely have equal opportunity, irrespective of how they choose, we wouldn't need affirmative action. But we're a long way, alas, from that world.
Yes, and the issue, the normative issue, is along the racial fault line, how you actually secure a minimum threshold for that equal participation. I mean, that's the kind of normative question, but it's also a very empirical question in terms of public policy. You know, how do you decide which past harm is related to the effects, you know, the compound effects, you know, right now that exclude people from citizenship.
Well, we even see that, if I may, Mara, in matters of elementary citizenship rights, voting. Take the state of Georgia, which has declared, is now recounting, but will continue to declare for President-elect Biden. 2 years ago, there was a governor's election, and we now can be pretty sure that it was a kind of 51-49 outcome where the Democrat Abrams lost, that different rules of access to registration, to actual voting, were such as to disenfranchise enough of a fraction of a population that would have voted for other than the winner to have secured the result. And there have been enormous efforts made in Georgia in the last 2 years to mobilize and overcome those barriers. And that's what makes many who lost the election angry in Georgia. But in fact, we see this in efforts to restrict the franchise in many places where it's hypothesized that those who would vote will vote no. No against my own or someone's preference. And I think, you know, if I had one thing I would do in America, I would go the Australian route of voting. It is an obligation to vote. It is mandatory to vote. Every adult citizen votes. You don't vote, you get fined. And you could go to the poll and vote none of the above. You could leave a blank ballot if you don't like anybody. But it is the elementary character of citizenship that everybody gets the right vote. And at minimum, we shouldn't put up barriers to registration. We shouldn't put up barriers to voting. We shouldn't have huge counties of 100,000 people with one polling place, and so on. So that's a passion of mine, and I hope it's persuasive.
And it was my passion. That's why. Well, in Argentina, you also have mandatory voting. So I'm with you. And when I speak here about mandatory voting, people tell me it's not an obligation, it's a right, but that's completely arbitrary, let's say. I mean, you can decide it's a right and you can act on it, or it's one of the duties of citizenship, like paying taxes, for example, right? The duty to participate in the issues of the political community, which have been made even more difficult after the Supreme Court ruling, you know, Shelby versus V. Holder in 2013, you know, making completely inoperant the pre-clearance provision. We talked about this. I have many questions now, and I want to, so that was like a very self-indulging comment, but I'm with you with the mandatory voting. So this is from Maxine Einhorn. She has two questions. One, can you reiterate the effect of the Taft-Hartley on union benefits for people of color? And her second question is, have you been asked to participate in discussions of reparations for Black people whose ancestors were enslaved?
I'll start with the second. I'm very fortunate to have come to know Ta-Nehisi Coates. Many of you will know his writing. He wrote a very famous article making the case for reparations in at the Atlantic magazine some 5 years ago. And he, in fact, quoted when affirmative action was white in that article, and we talked quite a lot about reparations. So yes, there is a reparations movement. I think the reparations movement won't, I say this with reluctance, and I think Mr. Coates would agree with me, that is unlikely to succeed going through the front door, as it were. It will only succeed through the side door, and the side door being remedies of the kind that, to the kind of public policy discrimination in the not so distant past, but in the distant past of parents and grandparents, and in, still in my lifetime and in the lifetimes of persons on this webinar, as it were. So that I think is possible, but I think having the larger movement improves the chances of the more targeted movement for affirmative action succeeding. Back to Taft-Hartley. What Taft-Hartley did was change labor law to make it strategically very difficult for unions to succeed in areas of the country not already organized. This wasn't just an exclusion on racial basis, but the reason the Southerners, who were otherwise quite progressive in their politics, the reason they joined conservative Republicans in overturning President Truman's veto was that when they saw the word labor, they thought the word race. And they argued that if unions will succeed in organizing across the South, the consequence of that will be that the racial order will be undone. The Republicans didn't, on the whole, vote for Taft-Hartley on a racist or racial basis. They just wanted business prerogatives to be upheld as opposed to labor prerogatives, so standard conservatism. So you got a strange bedfellows alliance of Southern Democrats coming from a dirt poor region who liked the New Deal in the main, provided the racial order was intact, joined forces with Republicans who in the main did not like the New Deal, but they joined on the basis of legislation concerning labor. And what the labor unions did after Taft-Hartley was they pulled their organizers from those parts of the country where they thought we can no longer succeed. And in consequence, you got a low or no union South and parts of the Southwest as compared to a very heavily unionized Northwest and Midwest. But over time, those regions, absent labor becoming a national phenomenon, were unable to secure their gains. And as a footnote, you could say it's one reason union workers got good Blue Shield, Blue Cross, and other form of health insurance, but non-unionized workers did not. And the unions gave up their dream of national health insurance after they couldn't become a national class.
Thank you. We have another question here coming from two long questions from Ellen Pechman. I know there's a hand raised over there. We cannot take questions live, but if you would like to type it in Q&A or in chat, I'll take it. So Ellen asks, as an age peer of IRAs with a career in federal education policy, I'm always aware of the great flaws that characterize many well-intended, quote unquote, but also many ill-advised compromises. What are your thoughts about helping people deal in greater nuance as they think about and critique public policy's history and its unfolding today?
I could give a 2-hour answer, which we don't have, or a very short answer. The short answer is I would come back to one of the motivations that I had, which is to get the story straight. Whether it's in education, whether it's in social welfare, whether it's in military affairs, the United States has a very complicated history. It has glories and it has terrible limitations and what Avishai Margalit called rotten compromises. We should understand what they've been. And we should, as President Obama used to say, and as many others have said, we should look to maximize the best features of our character and move in full knowledge and sharing accurate information, not simply to polemicize, but to ground it in history and say, can we make things more fair? We'll really open up the United States in a decent way. How we would do that subject by subject, including in education, not just in higher education, but in K through 8 and so on, that will take a very long, I'd love to have that conversation, but we probably can't have it in detail now. But I think start by getting the story right. And then we move from there to state what our goals are ethically, normatively, and see what steps we need to take pragmatically to move us from here to there. And I should say the Eisenhower Congress did that in the early 1950s with respect to Social Security. Not every bad compromise cannot be remedied. It can.
Would it, I mean, I'm jumping here, maybe, taking my prerogatives, but do you think that we can start in terms of the education with housing, like credit reform, mortgage access?
Yes, I absolutely do. And there are a good many scholars who know far more about the political economy of housing to know how we could do that. But I think we currently have a very major opportunity given the price of money. It would be possible to launch far better than the subprime mortgages were done before the crisis of 2008. Very focused policies that could equalize in housing markets.
Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about that with John Powell, by the way,
Great.
for everyone. So I'm going to leave you off the hook only on this because we have another question. Ellen is saying that's so clear. Yes, we have to get the record straight. So thank you. And she has another question. By the way, we share a reading group with Ellen Arendt reading group. So Ta-Nehisi Coates' work is so critical to broadening understanding and misunderstanding of so many of us well-intended, quote-unquote, liberals and quote-unquote progressives who struggle to understand why reparations. So she says, suggestion to listeners, if you haven't read Ta-Nehisi Coates, etc., read We Were 8 Years in Power and Reparation article that Ira mention. Okay, I thought that there was a question. It's not. Sorry about that.
But thank you for that thought. Yeah.
So Sarah Wilcox, my observations are limited to San Francisco, but my impression of many building trade and industrial unions and excluding longshoremen is that they were not welcoming to non-white workers. What about nationally?
Yeah, I think the same was true nationally. Let me give you a story from my current university and a puzzle which follows from this. If any of you know Columbia University, you will know that in the area that near 125th Street and Broadway, which is 5 blocks from the northern most part of the main campus, which ends at 120th Street and Broadway, Columbia is building under the auspices of a great architect, Renzo Piano, a number of new buildings, an additional campus, in effect, for for an institute on mind, brain, and behavior, for work on engineering, for business school, and so on. And that's construction work. Of course, overwhelmingly, Columbia has been committed to have union construction work. But we have one big exception. We are allowed, we signed agreements even with the unions. We forced them to sign agreements that we could hire non-union shops in a minority of the construction work being done. There's a lot of construction work under two conditions. Either they were minority owned, and minority could also include female owned, which is women have not exactly been leaders in construction, but primarily geared to ownership of firms by African Americans and Latinos. And and second, even if white owned, they would have to open up jobs to the surrounding neighborhood of principally West Harlem, and Washington Heights, which are overwhelmingly Black and Latino. And because if we had stuck to union-only job contracts, the proportion of minorities, including people who live adjacent to our campus, who would have been eligible for jobs would have been very small. Especially glaring is the Carpenters Union. The Carpenters Union, 3 weeks ago, demonstrated outside our main campus and put up an inflated rat because we had hired under previous agreements, a non-union firm that was hiring exclusively for construction work above a threshold of wages, not exploitative wages, within the Harlem community. And their argument was Columbia has hired a non-union shop, unions only. And of course, our response has been, yes, unions only, if only the unions would be open to all qualified workers, irrespective of their background. And so this issue resonates. And I'm a person who's never crossed a picket line in my life. But in this case, I support the balance of union and non-union because there's more than one good to be served in using construction money at a university at the present, not 50 years ago or 100 years ago, but right now.
That's a great answer. And it points to the question before about nuances and how, I mean, there's no one size fit all. And you actually, in terms of providing opportunities, what it's called leveling the playing field, which is an expression that I actually don't like, but I'm using it nonetheless, that you really need to look at what is involved, like get the record straight, not only historically, but also situationally. When you put forward these kind of assessments. So thank you for that illustrative story, as always. I may add, someone is saying, too bad you don't allow conversation. I agree, but it's impossible. We do the best we can. And people are saying how much they enjoy the conversation and look forward, to so much more. I want to respect, Ida, your time. I would spend hours. It's not that we're going to share a bus ride as we once did for hours and talk, but this was great. Thank you so much. You are the interim provost of Columbia, teaching courses involving congressional advising. I know, your time is super valuable. So I thank you so much. It meant a lot to me personally and for everyone, for you to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, let me give my thanks. First of all, it is the wish of every author to have his or her work discussed. Critically or otherwise. I'm very pleased that the publisher Norton Books has asked me to write they want to do a new edition, and I'll just, not to change the text, but to write a preface that speaks both to the current condition, but also addresses some criticisms which are of the book along the way, and what I've learned from them. So I'm hoping that'll come out, probably not for 9 or 10 months from now. But it is the opportunity to talk in this way about fundamental issues, whether persons here fully agree or don't agree. It's the chance to have a vibrant conversation, and especially conducted by someone with the skill, the great awareness and skill you have, Mara. We haven't seen each other for some time, but it was one of my great treats to know you when you were yet a graduate student, and to have watched your sustained curiosity and intellect and leadership grow over the years. So thank you for that privilege of being with you, and thank you all for being here. The work being done by this institute, it seems to me to be of basic importance, of creating a vibrant public sphere, as it were, for discussion and debate of fundamental questions, as it were, across the age spectrum. If I lived in San Francisco, I would sign up as a member. I certainly am qualified by virtue of age. Thank you all. And
that's your only qualification for taking the courses, the age. I'm going to go with that. With all the honesty we've shared throughout the decades, other than that, you would be teaching the courses.
Well, anyway, onward.
Thank you, Ira. Thank you so much.
Thank you, professors.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
All the
everyone
best,
for joining
everybody.
us.
Stay safe, stay well.